my field of study is in practical theology, which basically means theology that has a practical purpose to it. And which, when I argue with theologians, I tend to tell them that all theology should be practical theology. It should be applicable to your life. And specifically, I focus on things like contextual theology. How do we preach the gospel in certain context, and missiology? How do we preach the gospel in certain contexts around the world? So, Pastor Chad, we were talking about this Wednesday, and we moved some stuff around to make next week a little bit more special, a little bit more robust. And he goes, "Hey, do you have any missions messages?" And I said, "Yes, I have about 70 of them." So I'm going to unpack a few things tonight for you that hopefully help you tie your heart back to missions. We are supposed to be doing the mission of God until he comes. That's the idea of the Great Commission found in Matthew chapter 28. So we're just going to kind of dive in, and then I interviewed a missionary in Vietnam this week, talked to him. He's a friend of mine, so we'll be showing that at the end, and we'll tie it all together for you. But I want to introduce you to somebody. She's going to be on my screen. Her name is Agnes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Agnes here, if you can see Agnes. This is Agnes, and Agnes was born in Macedonia on August 26, 1910, and at the age of 12, she felt strongly the call of God. She knew she was supposed to be a missionary to share the love of Jesus around the world, and so at the age of 18, she left her home in Skopje, Macedonia, and joined a local Irish community of nuns who had a focus on missions in India. And after about 6 months or so of training in 1931, Agnes goes into India and begins to teach at a school. And she teaches and she teaches and she teaches, but every day when she's teaching, she's looking outside her window and seeing the abject poverty that India is and was, especially back in the 30s. And so she goes to her local area director in the convent and says, "Look, I want to do something for the people out there. I love teaching people in here, but I really need to be out there because I feel that's where God's calling me." And so they gave her a blessing, and she started kind of a school, an open-air school for kids in the slums in India. And it grew, and volunteers came alongside of her, and then money soon followed the ministry and extended the scope of her work in India. And it's the work that she did in India that made Agnes one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Agnes, or Mother Teresa as you know her, influenced the world through acts of compassion. But the story doesn't stop there. In 1994, a young journalist goes and visits Mark and Huldah Buntain, who were legendary missionaries in India and did tremendous works. I've been in Calcutta. It is literal hell on earth. It's the worst place in the entire world I've ever been. Calcutta, India is the slums of the slums. It's horrific. I don't mean any disrespect to Calcutta, but it's just a terrible place. And that's where Mother Teresa thrived, and that's where Mark and Huldah Buntain, Assembly of God missionaries, thrived. And there's a huge church in Calcutta because of Mark and Huldah Buntain. So this young journalist in 1994 goes and interviews Mark and Huldah Buntain, and they said, "Hey, you know what? We need to take you over to meet Mother Teresa," which that would just be really cool, right? You go over, and all of a sudden you're sitting face to face to Mother Teresa. And this young journalist, the reason Mark and Huldah wanted him to go see Mother Teresa is he grew up in a life of poverty. At the age of 12, his dad was killed in a terrible car wreck. And so from the age of 12 into early adulthood, he relied on the compassion of people in his neighborhood. I mean, if you hear his story, basically he would have groceries that would show up almost every day from neighbors and people from the church, and that's how they lived from 12 years old to early adulthood. And so he's sitting across the table from Mother Teresa, and he's telling his story, and it's a sad story, it's a brokenhearted story, and Mother Teresa looks at him and stares at him, and she points her little finger at him and says, "Well, what are you doing?" for the poor, the broken, and the helpless. As he gets on his airplane and he flies back home, he's haunted over and over and over again by those words. The young journalist's name was Hal Donaldson. And Hal began coming back to California, in Northern California, and loaded up his truck and started delivering groceries to people who had need there in Northern Cal. Then Hal started a little organization called Convoy of Hope. Convoy of Hope is one of the largest charitable organizations on planet Earth today. They have annual donations from 200 to 500 million every single year. It's compassion that led to action for both Mother Teresa and Hal Donaldson. Several years ago, one of my first mission trips, I went to Brazil. And, my first mission trip was actually on our honeymoon. We went to the Dominican Republic, and it scared me to death. I'm like, I don't ever want to leave America ever again. This is awful. Love my bride. I don't want her to get killed or kidnapped right here in this land. But I started traveling early on as a youth pastor, and I got the opportunity to go to Brazil. And in Brazil, I was in the same leper colony that Pastor Mark has referred to, in the same church. I preached in that church, full of lepers, full of people with limbs missing, and there's a pastor there, and I use his restroom, and I use his soap, and I eat his food, and I get done preaching, and I walk out with the missionary, and the missionary begins to tell me how things operate in Brazil. The Assemblies of God in Brazil actually rotates their pastors every so often, kind of like Methodists do. They go from congregation to congregation. And he said, except for this one pastor. This one pastor in a leper colony refuses to leave because he cares so much for the people who are hurting, broken, and just outright destitute. And then he tells me a little story that was a secret back in the day. This is 15 years or so ago. He said, because this man has dedicated himself to the leper colony, he now has leprosy. And he knew, because how you get leprosy isn't instant contact, it's prolonged contact. If you have a long contact relationship in the same presence of people who have leprosy for a long period of time, you're going to get leprosy. And this pastor steps into this role and stays there knowing that if he stays, he'll die there with the same disease of the people that he loves. That's compassion. Now, oftentimes when we talk about the idea of compassion, we tend to think of kindness and sympathy, but there's something more deeper, something more powerful, more profound in the actual language that we get the word compassion. It comes from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with, and in the Greek, it actually went a little bit further, and it's basically broke down into Greek. This word compassion breaks down into Greek where it's your suffering is my suffering, your heartbreak is my heartbreak, your pain is my pain. It's not this distant thing, it's something that we're deeply connected to. And the reason is the reason we should lean into this, and the reason that the Bible is saturated with this idea of compassion, that it seeps through the pages of the Old Testament and then the Gospels and presents itself as a challenge to the people of God, is because God himself has always been a compassionate God. Always have been. The Old Testament would record this in Psalm 86 and Psalm 103. It says, "But you, Lord, are compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and in faithfulness." He also says, "As the Father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him." Isaiah would say it this way, "They will neither hunger nor thirst, nor will the desert heat or the sun beat down on them. He who has compassion on them will guide them and lead them beside springs of water." He goes on in chapter 30 and says, "Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. Therefore he will rise up to show you compassion, for the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait on him." So the biblical idea of compassion is your suffering is my suffering, your pain is my pain, your heartbreak is my heartbreak. In other words, compassion is actually incarnational, if you understand that word. What is the incarnation? Well, Paul tells us in Philippians that in Philippians that God did not think that man could kind of equal themselves out with God or understand God. I'm paraphrasing it here. And so he humbles himself, he empties himself, and he comes down and takes the form of a man, takes the form of a servant, and even dies the death of a horrible criminal. That's incarnational, meaning that you put yourself in the place where you can be compassionate. Does that make sense? Compassion is an action verb. And what we see in the Bible over and over and over again is this concept of compassion, and Jesus demonstrated compassion throughout his ministry. I want you to look at Matthew chapter 20 for a second. Before we go to our core text, this is just one example of Jesus in his ministry. Behold, there were two blind men sitting by the roadside, and they heard Jesus was passing by. They cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." Now, let me just pause because theology is what I do. I need to point this out. Those two terms, Lord, puts Jesus in an elevated position. This idea of Son of David is basically them aligning Jesus with messiahship, with Christhood, if you will. And they actually say it twice. The crowd tries to rebuke them, telling them to be silent. And they say it again, probably louder, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And so Jesus stops. And he called them and said, this is so odd to me because, Jesus knew what they wanted. I think he needed them to verbalize it. But he said, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be open." Jesus in pity, that word pity actually translates to the Greek word compassion, touched their eyes. And immediately they recovered their sight and they followed him. You see, anytime you see Jesus being moved with compassion in the Bible, it led to some sort of action in the Bible. He's moved with compassion, so he heals. He's moved with compassion, so he feeds. He's moved with compassion that he offers salvation and forgiveness of sins, all because he's moved with compassion. Now, the thing is, in Western culture, oftentimes we think we're compassionate, but I think we're more concerned than compassionate because oftentimes the Western church looks around and we're concerned about the things of the world, but we're not moved with compassion enough to actually take action. We drive by the local homeless shelter and it breaks our heart, and then we keep on driving. We see the people starving on the road, it breaks our heart. We are broken up about it, but we just don't step over the finish line with action. But compassion is always followed by action. And Jesus does this great demonstration in Mark chapter 6. If you look at Mark chapter 6, it's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And it starts off in verse 30, and I want to read it to you. And I have some things highlighted on the screen, and they're highlighted intentionally. But let's just read the entire passage for a second. It said, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught." So there's context to what's happening. The context of what's happening is Jesus has just sent his disciples out by themselves to go do miracles in the villages around Galilee. And oh man, Mark tells us what miracles they are. It says that they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them without Jesus. It's basically like Jesus says, "Okay, go, I'm going to take the training wheels off." You remember that? I remember teaching my girls how to ride a bike. It was a nightmare, right? They think they're ready and you're like, "Okay, go," and you let them go, and they go about 2 pedals, and they stop pedaling, and they just, right? And then they run into the house and cry to mama that daddy's trying to hurt them or something like that, and daddy comes in and says, "Put some dirt in it, be tough, you're tough, you're tough." And I always thought I would have boys, and the more I realize I have girls, the more I realize that dad's probably approach is not always best, all right? So usually they would learn how to ride a bike because mom would go back out there and go, "Now, sweetie, let me just," and she would hold on and hold on and hold on, and then finally let go, and they would pedal, and I'm sitting on the porch just saying stuff underneath my breath that how can she do that and I can't? But you remember that, taking off the training wheels and letting them go. This is what Jesus is doing in this moment with his disciples. He's going, I want you to go out. I want you to do the things that you've seen me do. Now go. And so what Mark tells us in Mark chapter 6 is that the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. They were excited. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Now, you'd have to go to Israel to picture this picture, but they're crossing the shore of Galilee to another area, and everybody sees the boat and all these towns, which the Galilee region is not flat, it's kind of hilly, and so they start taking off on foot, ready and waiting for Jesus to get there. And Mark tells us later that about 5,000 people, men, emptied out, which might have been more, and they wait for the apostles. Verse 34, when he, being Jesus, went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began to teach them many things, compassion leading to action. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. So I'm sure it went deathly silent. And they respond, but Lord, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, I picture this in my mind. This is all we have, Jesus. We have 5 fish and 2 loaves. Now, just take a moment and look around this room. Look at every chair in this room. Every chair in this room equals 2,800 chairs. Times that by 2. And here, I'm sitting here holding an individual slice of pizza, and I go, this is what we're going to feed everybody. And Jesus takes the fish, and he commands all of them to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s, and taking the 5 loaves, I mixed that around. I think I said 2 loaves and 5 fish, but you get the point. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men, meaning there were probably women and children, so it quite possibly could have been 10,000. Now, when I read this passage, it's an amazing story, but Jesus is trying to do something for his disciples. He's trying to help them understand the difference between concern and true compassion, because they had concern. They looked around and they saw that there was a need, but they didn't do anything. So he kind of began to help them understand this in an object lesson. Because here's the difference between concern and compassion. First, concern sees the problem. Compassion sees an opportunity. The disciples understood that people were hungry and stirring, yet they never thought they could possibly be the solution. Now, I'm not going to take up an offering tonight. I never do on a Wednesday. I'm not taking up a missions offering. I'm not taking up a pledge, nothing like that. But you have to understand something. There are people in this room who God has been working on your heart to do something for missions, and the enemy keeps going, what's that really going to do? That $1 a week that you might pledge, or that $1 a month that you might pledge, or the 25 cents that you give your kids for BGMC, what's that really going to do? But concern sees the problem and tries to make excuses, but compassion sees the opportunity. Jesus sees 5 loaves and 2 fish and goes, I can work with that. I can do something with that, right? Secondly, concern sees it as someone else's problem, but compassion takes personal action. I'm sure the disciples were thinking to themselves, how could the people get out to this place and not have anything to eat? I'm sure they even blamed them. I can't believe they all ran out here, Jesus, at dusk, and they ran out here. They're far away from home. What a bunch of idiots. How could they put themselves in this position? Jesus, I just don't understand. It's their fault they got addicted to the drugs. Why do I have to do something about it? It's their fault that they're homeless. Why do I have to do something about it, right? See, concern always goes, it's someone else's fault, where compassion actually steps in and goes, okay, there's a problem, there's a real need, but I can do something about it. Doesn't matter how big or small. Compassion always moves us to action. Thirdly, compassion is typically frozen by the vast need, but compassion uses what it has. If you were at the missions banquet or have heard Pastor Mark talk on Sunday and he talks about his miracle goal of $1 million, all of us kind of go, whoa, how are we going to do that? That's huge, Pastor. You want to help build project rescue centers around the world? How are we going to do that's just too vast. That's just too big. I could never do that. And that's what the disciples' problem is. They're looking around going, we can't feed these people. It's too big of a problem. What's interesting is when you understand a denarii was a day's wage. So when they go up to Jesus and go, that's 200 denarii, what they're telling him is that's 200 days worth of pay, 3/4 of a year. 3/4 of a year. Now put yourself in that situation. You and your buddies are hanging out, you're praying, and the Lord goes, I want you to collectively get together and give about two-thirds of somebody's salary away at the table. I'd be like, 1, 2, 3, not it. Right? No thanks. It's a big problem. When we deal with missions, it's always a big problem. There are billions of people in the world who are going to hell, and there are billions of people that on their way going to hell, they're suffering at the same time. They're hungry, they're homeless, they're broken, they're beaten, they're robbed, they're sexually trafficked. It is a big problem. We have big problems in this world. The Western church, for far too often, just goes, I'm going to bury my head in the sand. And we have created holy huddles where we're not moved with compassion to do something about it. The next one, concern operates in the natural, but compassion makes room for the supernatural. I don't know how missiologists work out this statistic. $1 equals 3 salvations. Well, I know how. It's because what we think is naturally impossible, God takes, multiplies it, and does something supernatural with it, that the gospel reaches those people and they get saved. Concern always sees the natural, right? And I'm just like you. If I walked in a room and there are 5,000 starving people, I'm looking at the number. There's 5,000 starving people. I don't know how to do this. Right? I see this stuff. I'm concerned, but I see the natural, and I can't get past, I can't get out of my way. But God somehow, when you move with compassion, God somehow allows you to start operating in the supernatural. I've seen it time and time again. The biggest missions offering I ever took, the church that I pastored was about 250, 300 people, and I went to the Project Rescue event. And I'm sitting there, and I have the pledge card in my hand, and I'm like, okay, I feel like God wants our church to give $50,000, a quarter of our missions budget. We had a very healthy missions budget, but I had to raise it within 30 days. So I come back, and I get ready, and I pitch it, and I'm thinking, oh, if we could just get 20. Then I'll call Project Rescue, and they'll be happy. I'll just say, we couldn't hit our budget. And I took up this offering, and I don't know how we did it, but we gave over $60,000 within 30 days to a project. Now, all glory belongs to God, because I looked at it. Look, when it comes to money, as a pastor, I am the most faithless person there is. Like I was always worried about how are we going to meet budget? How are we going to make missions budget? How are we going to provide for these projects? How are we going to provide for these missionaries? But no matter, when we stepped out in compassion and we started doing action, then God made sure that we were supplied for the mission. Always. Always. Every single year, we exceeded what we thought we could give in missions as a church because God moves in the supernatural. And here's what I know. When you operate with compassion, God will meet your own needs. That's the lesson from Mark chapter 6. The disciples carried home to their families basketfuls of food. Jesus shows them that compassion leads to blessing. You see, concern sends people away in hopes that someone else will address the problem, but compassion rolls up its sleeves and gets involved. Compassion starts making a difference. Many times we're like the disciples. We're concerned about many things. We preach about our concerns. We discuss our concerns, and we inform the Lord in prayer about our concerns. But God wants us to move from concern to compassion. How do we do this? Well, the change requires a whole understanding of the whole gospel of engagement, which we see illustrated in the story in the Old Testament prophet Micah. Now, Micah was called by God to speak his words to Jerusalem, and he spoke not as a city dweller, but as a peasant from a rural area. In Jerusalem, all the peasants were exploited. They were seen to be worthy to make money for the city, but not worthy to share in the profits of their own labors. And Jerusalem, known as the city of God, was full of corruption, abuse, and leaders dedicated to selfish gain, a city filled with brokenness and pain. And it's within this context that Micah cries out to God. And in chapter 6, we see God's reply. He calls the city and the leaders to account for their lies. It is as if God opens up a court case against the city and outlines the things that are important to him. And he says this in Micah chapter 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? So shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? To do justice, love mercy and kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Now, some theologians and commentators call this a threefold conversion that every Christian needs to have. First, of course, is our conversion to God. That's when we come to Christ in faith and experience the privilege of discovering our inclusion into the family of God because of the work that he's accomplished. We discover his compassion, his mercy, his grace, all pointed towards us. But the second conversion is that we need to have a conversion to living beyond ourselves and to serving others. Paul would say it this way in Romans chapter 12. He does this beautiful 11 chapters of what the gospel is. And in chapter 12, verse 1, it's not on your screen, he says, in view of all this, in other words, in view of God's mercy, offer yourself as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And then he goes out and he begins to spell out what Christian living really is. I've said this before. Martin Luther used to say, God doesn't need your good works, your neighbor does. Because your good works can't save you, but your good works can help lead other people to Christ. There's this threefold conversion. The second one is that we live beyond ourselves. And the third conversion is a restoration of the broken places, public, social, and political. Our compassion, our love, our mercy that we live out in the public sphere should begin to change our cities and societies. Now, there's a biblical concept for this. We call it peace, but the Bible calls it shalom. Now, peace today means this inner calm. I just have to have some peace and quiet, right? Get the kids out of the house. I just need some peace. Can I take my kids over to your house just so I can get a moment to think and have peace? We think of it as inner calm, but that's not what the Hebrew term actually conveys. Really, shalom has an understanding that all things are woven together. Psalm 102 talks about creation, and it points to the fact that God is not just simply He didn't simply make the world by throwing millions and billions and little entities together, but God put the world together specifically and beautifully, interdependently, harmoniously, knit it together and webbed it together. And this knitting and webbing and interdependence is what the Bible calls shalom. And sin broke shalom. It tore it apart. Men were never supposed to be at war with one another. Men were never supposed to sell one another in slavery. There was never supposed to be hate in the world. There was never supposed to be violence in the world. And we see that the first sin committed outside of the garden is what? Violence and death. It was never supposed to be that way. Shalom was broken. And so what the Christian is supposed to do in this threefold conversion is supposed to go back while Jesus tarries, while he waits on his return, and go back and try to restore the broken places in the world. And we do that by acts of compassion. Why? Why does that matter? Well, acts of compassion actually starts giving dignity back to people that the enemy and sin has stolen from them. When someone is homeless or hungry, by feeding them and helping them get back on their feet, you are restoring brokenness. You are restoring a sense of shalom back in their life. Now, we're never gonna fully restore shalom, but that doesn't mean we can turn our back on it. That doesn't mean we can say it's someone else's responsibility. That doesn't mean we can ignore it. No, we are supposed to continue to do it. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 5. He says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. We've all heard that term. And then he goes on and says, God has given you a ministry of reconciliation. You are Christ's ambassador on the earth. God has changed you, but he didn't just change you for your own salvation. He has changed you for the salvation of the world. When you look at the heartbeat of God, when it comes to missions, the heartbeat of God is found in Genesis. God establishes Abraham not for Abraham's sake, but for the entire world's sake. God establishes Israel not for Israel's sake, but to be a beacon to the entire world. When we come to the New Testament, God established the church not so that they can be a church and have good services and good emotions and all of us sing kumbaya, but he establishes it. Why? Acts 1:8, to be a light to the world, to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. God has always had a compassionate and missions-driven heart. So why should we think we should avoid missions and compassion? We are to be constantly working to build back shalom. The world is desperate for a church that moves from concern to compassion and action. Paul says this in Galatians. He's talking to the Galatian church and he says, let us not become weary in doing good. For at a proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. As we came into this missions conference, I am sure some of you are just weary of doing good. Man, we have another serve day? We just had one in September. I know this because Oklahoma played Nebraska on serve day, and I couldn't watch it. I had to TiVo it, if TiVo's even a thing anymore, right? You might be going, man, we just did that. Man, I just finished up a missions pledge. I got to go again. Man, we just got backpacks for kids in a local school or Christmas presents or turkeys. And you're just sitting there going, oh, it gets taxing. Paul would remind us, let us not become weary in doing the good that we're supposed to be doing as a church. And as we have an opportunity, let us do even more good. That's the charge for you today. Maybe God's not calling you to be a full-time missionary. Maybe he's not calling you to be a preacher. Maybe he's not calling you to give $100,000 to missions, but he's calling you to be moved with compassion that causes an action in your life. So as we pray tonight, and as we go into the next week and the final wrap-up of our missions convention, I want you to start praying to God. God, I want to be moved with compassion, but I don't know what that action is yet. I want you to be praying that prayer over the next 10 days and see what the Lord would do in your life. Somebody asked me today about John 15:16, the prayer where Jesus says, you can ask anything in my name and I'll give it to you. That prayer is actually tied to producing fruit. It's not about getting stuff. It's actually about when we pray a prayer that says, God, make me fruitful, he's going to answer you and make you fruitful. So I want you to pray those prayers this week and next as we end the missions convention in a couple weeks. Stand with me. Let me pray over you and bless you, and then you can go pick up your kids. Father, you are a God with so much compassion for this earth and for humanity. You said in your word, it's not your will or desire that any should perish, but you want everybody to come to repentance. You said that the harvest is ripe, but the workers are few. Father, I pray that that's not Visalia first. I pray that we continue to do good, do acts of compassion, preach the gospel, give, do things so that the gospel expands around the earth until you call us home. Father, I pray you bless this people. They've been so faithful to you in missions over the years. They've been so faithful to your kingdom and serving in the city over the years. Lord, let us not get weary in doing good. But while we have the opportunity, may we continue to do it. Bless them in your name.